Thank you, Brigitte. First of all, thanks to you for having organized this roundtable. I think that's good for us, who do research also to test our ideas and concepts in front of a challenging reality. What I'm going to say has some links with what Henrik and also Ramon said. Let me start by saying how important the test is for the EU. I mean, we had previous government that wanted to question and to challenge what they presented as a fiscal straitjacket. But we had Hollande in 2012, who was politically very weak and very quickly pretended that he had obtained something, whereas he had obtained nothing. And then we had Tsipras, who was financially very weak and was not in a position to challenge the framework. And also it was a very small country, so with little leverage. And we had, from time to time, Italian governments, Spanish governments also wanting to question the framework, but never we had such a confrontation like the one we are seeing coming with a government that has put forward a program that is assessed by the Observatory of the Catholic University being of the tune of 100 billion annually, more spending and tax cuts, because you're adding the tax cuts on the one side and the spending, the social spending on the other side. So if you're adding the two components of the program, the coalition, you're coming very quickly with extremely large numbers. So I'm not saying that's something that is going to be actually the program of the government. The government itself will make some choices, but that's where we're starting from. So 6% of GDP of additional deficit. Starting from a situation that's, as we all know, was a sort of precarious stability with a high primary surplus, but a very high level of public debt, and essentially no growth. So we have this on the side of the program, and then we have the political confrontation. We know that part of the government, and that was very much highlighted by the initial crisis when President Mattarella refused to appoint Paolo Savona as finance minister, part of the coalition that is advocating confrontation with the EU and the Eurozone and possibly an exit from the Euro and a Plan B. So that's new, and that's a big challenge for Italy, which is a big challenge for Europe. Now, the second point I'd like to make is that, and a bit it was said, also in the previous intervention, in any country that hasn't had growth for 20 years, the case for continuity is extremely weak. You can't just tell, the Italians, go on, keep on, containing spending, and stay on the same track. The number that summarizes it is that if you compare the fiscal policy that Italy has had since the start of the euro with the fiscal policy that France has had from the start of the euro, I'm taking primary surplus. If France had the primary surpluses of Italy for 20 years, it would have a public debt ratio of 45% of GDP instead of 96%. So that tells you something about the degree of fiscal restraint there has been in Italy. The problem in Italy has been the denominator. Has been no growth, no real growth for 20 years. As you said, we are in terms of GDP per capita, we are at the level of 1997. So it's really on that side that change should be brought. Now the difficulty is that the government says it wants to focus on growth, but essentially it puts forward demand side proposals, not so much supply side proposals. And I think the key would be a significant change, but which much more focus on the supply side, meaning much more focus on productivity and much more focus on labor market participation. Productivity has been extremely weak. If you compare the productivity record of Italy with that of, which is not stellar by far, of other European countries for the last 10 years or 20 years, I mean, you're half a percentage point or a full percentage point below. And we know why, because a large part of the Italian economy is composed of very traditional, small-size enterprises with relatively poor management, little efficiency gains, and also that employ people that are relatively unskilled. So it's stuck in a low efficiency, low productivity, low growth economy. And I think the whole challenge would be to use this call for change to bring the necessary transformation that the Italian economy needs. So what does it mean? As you said, we don't have silver bullet. I mean, it's clear that its conversation needs to start, that some of the reforms the EU should be able to support and should find the instruments to support. It's not just using the traditional instruments, it's perhaps thinking creatively about what could be done. And all this discussion about the investment fund, the discussion about instrument for support, the support of structural reform, that's part of the discussion, that should be part of the discussion. But clearly this requires also, on the side of the Italian government, the willingness to consider that the response to the problem is much more on the supply side than on the demand side. Now, some comments on the wider implication for the Eurozone system. A situation where you have a confrontation between rules and popular will, or between bureaucrats and populists, it's really the perfect storm for a policy system. Certainly, those in the Italian coalition who want to leave the Eurozone, what they would wish is really a very bureaucratic, rules-based response to their request, because they would turn to the electorate and say, look, we want change, and the bureaucrats in Brussels, they just want us to continue the way we've been doing things for 20 years, and we know it doesn't work. So that's really the perfect storm. What does it mean? It means that in a situation that's not unique, we're going to have to be facing this type of situation probably with other countries. I mean, we've had elections in Slovenia recently. We had, in a period where the probability of governments in a confrontational mode with the EU come to power is relatively high. And I think the fact that we say that we have encapsulated the wisdom, the policy wisdom, in a system of policy rules, and everybody has to conform to those rules, is really a dangerous type of setup. I think we need to recognize that this type of situation, there should be more decentralization of responsibility. That means government have to be more responsible for what they do and face the consequences, which brings in this question of, is fiscal discipline essentially fostered by the rules and by the discipline coming from Brussels, or is it more, should it be more home-based, based on domestic institutions, and if not, also on market disciplines, meaning that government have to confront the market in the case they depart from sustainability. That's something we proposed. We're not advocating in our paper at all that there should be automatic restructuring or anything of this sort, but we're saying there should be more decentralization, and ultimately that means that we have to accept that restructuring can be, at the last resort, part of the rules of the game in the Eurozone. And I think there's a technical argument for it, but also there's a political argument for it, and I'm emphasizing here the political argument. I think that's something we need to consider. Now, on the remark on the Euro exit, I think, because this is also part of the discussion, I think we've learned something with the decision by President Mattarella about the distinction between constitutional issues and normal policy issues that have don't have a constitutional dimension. Essentially, what I found very interesting in his own interpretation of his decision not to appoint Paolo Savona. But he said this is essentially a major question, a question of constitutional nature about Italy. And this should not be decided upon just because a government decides to appoint a certain minister who happens to have a plan, and therefore market will react and Italy will be driven out of the Eurozone by this sort of development of events. This is an issue Italians have the right to decide, but this should be on the basis of a deliberation that is deep, that considers the consequences, and that is conducted in the open, which means a sort of constitutional decision that needs to be taken in this way. And I think that's also an important dimension, not only for Italy, but more broadly. To end, I'd like to echo also what Henrik said about refugees. I think the way the EU has been dealing with the refugee situation in Italy and the fact that Italy has been left alone is certainly something that we should regret, and we should blame the decision-making mechanism of the EU for that. That means that's one of the roots of the situation we're seeing. Now, if we want to change that, and I think this is desirable, and what Chancellor Merkel said in the interview on the longer-term goal of having a single asylum law, a single asylum refugees agency, and a single border police is very important, I think, as a goal for the medium to long term. Now, if we want to have a serious and productive conversation with Italy on that, this also requires some restraint on the part of the Italian government. And the first declaration we've heard by Matteo Salvini about the way refugees are going to be treated can create some worry about the possibility of having a fruitful conversation on that. Thank you.